character and setting for poetry, we're not going to re-talk about the cultural setting and the historical setting of poetry. We're not going to discuss natural setting in poetry and all that stuff. Oh, you already learned that. You already know that. I don't have to tell it to you again in regards to poetry, because it's the same thing. What I'm going to be doing going forward is, with regards to poetry, is just telling you the parts about character and setting that are different in regards to poetry. The extra stuff on top of what you already know about character and setting in regards to what you've learned. All right. So this is the extra stuff. So do not do the flushing away of information. Everything that you already know about character and setting needs to be brought forward, because you're going to use it. In fact, you're going to use it for this week's assignment for the comparing the two Frost poems that you're going to read. But on top of what you already know about character and setting, you're also going to weave in the couple of new things that I'm going to discuss here. So a little bit different way of looking at character and poetry, because you may not have actual specific characters in poems, right? Sometimes you will. Sometimes there's going to be a poem that reads like a story. There's a lot of poems out there that read like stories with this character and that character and, sub characters and heroes and all sorts of stuff. But then there's going to be other poems that you read that don't have any characters at all, that don't even have people in them or things in them. They're just like explaining the color red. There's not even a person. So how do you deal with character in a poem? Sorry. How do you deal with character in a poem that has no people in it and has no thing in it? That's just a description of a color. So when that happens, you have to look at poetry and character a little different. And so we're going to talk about the speaker first and foremost. The two different character types that we're going to talk about in this slide set are the speaker and the listener. Okay, those are your two main things, the speaker and the listener. So when we're talking about the speaker in a poem, the speaker is a lot like when we talked about the narrator in fiction. Okay, so the speaker or persona is the voice of the poem. In a poem, it's the most significant character in poetry, especially in those poems that may not even have characters in them other than the person speaking. Not all poetic speakers have separate identities. In other words, sometimes the person speaking is just the person who wrote the poem. It's from their point of view. You can basically assume that what they're saying is how that person actually feels that wrote the poem. Other times they're writing it as maybe it's a man writing a poem from the perspective of a woman, but obviously he's not a woman, but that's how he wrote the poem. In that way he would be writing the poem from a different identity. But most poems and a lot of songs are usually written from the perspective of the writer. Okay? Poet is often the speaker. So think about a lot of like the bands that you like or a lot of the songs that you like. You kind of make an assumption that the person singing it feels the way that the song feels the way that the song is describing. I'm trying to think who recently came out with a song, and they were, was that Beyonce and Lemonade? Everyone jumped up and was like, there must be trouble in her marriage because she made this song, right? Because it didn't matter whether she had been the person who wrote the song or not. Because I'm not saying whether she did or didn't, because I actually have no idea. Maybe she did. But a lot of singers actually get their songs from somebody else. Like a lot of Britney Spears songs, she didn't write them. They came from other professional songwriters. And that's very common for a lot of singers to get their songs from professional songwriters. They don't write them themselves. So does that mean that that's how that songwriter felt? Or is that how the person singing it felt? I don't know. So it's an interesting thing that we make an assumption, especially with poetry, that the person saying the poem, the person writing the poem, the person singing the song, we assume that the speaker, the singer, that that's how they feel. If they're talking about how they hate strawberries, then we're going to be, oh, well, I guess they really hate strawberries, because that's what they're saying. That's what they're singing about. So the voice we hear may be considered as a brief dramatization of the poet's personality or needs. And that's usually how we feel about it. That's the assumption I make. That's usually the assumption we make about most, singers, songwriters, and poets in general. So that makes them more unique and a little different than how we view fiction writers. Okay, so still talking about speakers, we're going to talk about inside speakers and outside speakers. So first we're going to talk about the inside speaker. An inside speaker uses first person voice. So that means they're saying, I feel this way. I felt this way. My heart was breaking. My love for you is, right? They're involved inside of the poem's actions. My love for you is this strong. My heart aches for you. That kind of stuff. Lots of love poems have inside speakers. They are inside of what's going on. That's the inside speaker. Then you have something called the outside speaker. That's when the poet is giving you a poem, but they're using third person. It can be objective. They're talking from the outside as if they're telling you a story, but they're not inside of the poem, right? So this sounds like that narrator voice. It is the narrator voice. But in a poem, they'll call it the outside speaker, because it could still, even as an outside speaker, in a poem, it could still reflect how they themselves may feel. Additional information about speakers may be gleaned from other details in the poems, like the title or the way that the words are made. Sometimes the difference between using slang or using formal or informal wording lets you know the difference between one speaker and another, so that you could tell when they're going back and forth, especially like in something where there may be multiple speakers, like duets or something. All right. So those were talking about the speaker, right? I said we were going to talk about the speaker as character, and then we're going to talk about the listener. So the speaker is the person telling you the poem. The listener is a second type of character in the poem, which is kind of a weird thing. The listener can be the person with whom or to whom the speaker is talking to. So it's kind of a weird thing. The speaker talks directly to an on-the-spot listener whose reactions may directly affect the course of the poem. So dramatic monologue, that could mean something like, let's say the poet is saying something like, I'm here to tell you of a harrowing tale of something that's going on. Oh, I see you're interested now, my listener, but really, nobody has said anything. Nothing else has happened. Yet I, as the poet, act like I'm reacting to another person. That could be a dramatic monologue, as if there's somebody else there, another person, a listener that I'm talking to that nobody else can see but me. Okay, so that's one type of listener. There's like another character built into the poem that only I'm privy to. It's kind of a weird thing. But songs use that a lot. If you kind of listen to some songs over the next couple of days, notice how many of your songs will kind of go back and forth and actually have reactions. The singer will have reactions to things inside of the song, even though nobody else actually said anything else. There's only the singer, right? The singer is one person singing through the whole song. But all of a sudden, in the middle of the song, they'll be like, oh, I know you didn't feel that way, and now you're saying this. Well, why didn't you tell me that? And you're like, what who's what? What just happened? Well, you don't know because we aren't privy to that person. The listener, that type of listener, we're not there to see. Only the poet knows that. So you end up with this dramatic monologue. So that's one type of listener. The other type of listener that you have to pay attention to is understanding who is you, right? That's not me having terrible English. Who is you? It's important to find out who you is in a poem. If an author uses the word you need to know who they're talking to. Is there that on the spot listener, right? Are they talking about somebody specific? Like, you told me this, but you meant something else. You broke my heart. Then they might be talking about a specific person, like Taylor Swift, right? You just have to figure out which boyfriend she was talking about. I'm sorry. If you love Taylor Swift, I'm just giving you a hard time. But I mean, seriously, right? A lot of her songs are breakup songs. So there's a lot of yous in Taylor Swift songs. And the truth is, there's a lot of yous in all songs. Especially any song that's about love, good or bad. Whether it's a broken heart song or it's a schmoopy I love you, love is so wonderful song. There's going to be a lot of yous. And in that case, they're talking about somebody specifically, right? So who's that on the spot listener that they're talking to? It could be a colleague or a friend. More often than not, or very often, you could be just the conversational way that the speaker is talking to themselves. Like they could be saying, I'm wondering if I should have maybe taken that left in life earlier. I wonder if I would be in a totally different place if I would have gone to college at a different age. You know what I mean? Well, I'm not really talking to any one of you guys specifically. I'm just making conversation. I'm trying to think out loud. We often use the word you when we're thinking out loud or addressing a general audience to try to have a conversation. So it's important that you figure out, is the singer or songwriter or poet speaking to somebody specifically, or are they kind of generalizing to make a point and to have a conversation? So that's the other type of character in poetry, besides all of the stuff about character that you guys have already learned. Because we will read poems where there are actual little characters and sub-characters and stuff in there. But for the most part, it's going to be important for you to be able to find the speaker and the listener in a poem. Poems are sometimes little drama. Oh, that's what I just said. Sorry, I got ahead of myself. Poems are sometimes little dramas with major and minor participants. So a third type of character could be major and minor participants. This is actually pretty, I don't want to say it's rare because it's not rare. It's a certain type of poem. Ballads are often like this, where they'll start having multiple names and kings and queens and knights and Jack and Diane. I don't know. Where there's multiple people in this poem. Ballads, long ballads will often be that, where it's like a story in a poem form or a story in a song form. In that way, you may end up with major and minor characters like that because it's set out more in story form. You learn about those characters just like you do in a story. Appearances, speech, action, and reaction. So in that way, these are more and closest to a fiction story. But that's not the norm for poems. If you laid out all the poems in the world, a very small share of them would actually be these types of ballads. All right. Setting only gets one slide, because this is, I think, the last slide. Setting only gets one slide for poetry because we've already talked about setting to death, right? We've talked so much about setting, and all of those things we talked about setting moves over with us into poetry. And you're going to need to use those things about setting when you're looking at the Frost poems, okay? All that stuff about natural setting and manufactured setting, right? All of that comes with you to this poetry section. But on top of that is the fact that you're going to read poems that don't have a traditional setting. Every single fiction story you ever read is going to have a traditional setting because it took place somewhere. But poems don't have to. Poems don't have to be in a time and place. So it's sometimes more difficult to figure out setting in a poem. So how do you get at it? How do you figure out time and place? Sometimes you could try to get at it by figuring out how the person is talking. Are they speaking with a specific dialect? Are they using words that we don't use anymore, like Shakespearean language? That would kind of give us time and place. Are they talking about doing things that we do not do anymore? Like public hangings, that's a social convention that is not part of our lives anymore. That would give us a time frame and help us with setting. Or getting married at 13, or your parents choosing your spouse for you, stuff like that. I mean, that's not a social convention for most of us here in the United States in 2016. So that would indicate either an older time or a different country or a different culture, and it would help us narrow down a setting. So general circumstances of their lives. So sometimes that might be reflected inside of the poem as well. When specific settings are mentioned in a poem, it often has symbolic meaning. So look at it deeper. Remember what we talked about in the other slide set, and that idea of packing, right? That idea of economy. You only have a lunchbox to pack for a 2-week vacation. That's not a lot of room. You are not going to waste it on trying to shove an extra pair of tennis shoes in there when you haven't even packed any pants yet, right? So the poets are not going to waste space on describing setting unless it has some deeper meaning to them in the poem. They're just not going to do it. In a fiction story, it's okay to take up room and discuss setting and lay out a visual setting, even if it's not symbolic. But in a poem, they don't have time for that. There's no room for that. The space is so limited in poetry for them that they have to take every single little space they have and pack it with as much depth as they can. So if you do see that they're describing actual settings, like woods, hint, hint, there might be a deeper meaning there. Or if they're going to talk about a certain time of year or a certain type of weather pattern or anything like that, then there's going to be symbolic meaning to it. All right. So look deeper. So that's all I'm adding to setting on top of what you already know.